Buongiorno. I am very funny in English, so if you don't find me funny, let's just say I was lost in translation. I'm going to talk about hope today, but I want to tell you a little bit about my career journey to give you a sense of where I come from. I studied hope under Rick Snyder. Rick studied hope for 20 years, from the 1980s into the early 2000s, and he understood hope to be that belief that the future would be better than the present, coupled with the belief that we have the power to make it so. The belief that the future would be better than the present, coupled with the belief that we had the power to make it so. Hope is half optimism and half agency. So we put those two together and we're hopeful. He measured hope with simple scales. The Snyder Hope Scales are available online for no fee and can be used for research in any project around the world. Rick taught me so much about hope, and Thomas Krischak taught me so much about career development. He was first my teacher of career development at the University of Kansas, and then he was my colleague when I was a professor in counseling psychology at the University of Kansas. He taught me that even though I thought I made rational decisions about going into psychology, I had never made a single rational decision in my life. And then I worked some at Gallup with behavioral economists, including Danny Kahneman, Nobel Prize-winning psychologist who won a Nobel Prize in economics. And Danny taught me this interesting tidbit, and I think Rick taught this to me as well as Tom, but Danny put words to it. We are strangers to our future selves. We are strangers to our future selves. We're aiming our lives at this future that we're constantly constructing. And I notice this in my work with clients, that we talk about the future as if it's a real place, because we are creating memories of the future all the time. These memories of the future are as real as our memories of the past. And we feel, when we revisit those memories of the future, we feel as though we've already been there. So let me tell you a story about AJ, and AJ is a young man in Washington, D.C. And I met AJ through my work at Gallup. I'll tell you a little bit about that in a minute, but first, I'll tell you how I met AJ. I met AJ 3 years ago. He was sitting in a building in Washington, D.C. that his mother was cleaning. His mother's an immigrant from Ghana, and she was cleaning the building. And while she cleaned the building, AJ would sit and read and do schoolwork. And AJ then saw this gentleman come through the doors and said, "Hello." And then he said, "Sir, what do you do?" And the guy said, "Well, first off, my name is Jim, and I work at this little company here in Washington, D.C. And then Jim says to AJ, "What do you do?" He goes, "I hang out and read while my mother cleans this building." He goes, "Okay." And then AJ said, "Well, where do you work?" And he said, "Well, I work at Gallup, which is a polling company." And AJ said, "Well, how do I get a job there?" And Jim said, "You have to interview with me." He goes, "When can I do that?" And Jim said, "Let's talk to your mom." And they arranged an interview, and AJ showed up, nicely dressed, tons of questions, with lots of knowledge about Gallup. Now, just a little bit of history. He knew that Gallup was a polling company. It started in Princeton, New Jersey. It then went around the world and became the most famous polling company ever. And Gallup is synonymous with polling. He knew who George Gallup was. He knew that George Gallup died while working on a project in Europe. It's the project I happen to lead now, so wish me good health. And he knew all these things, and he had good questions, better questions than a lot of executives did when they interviewed for the job at Gallup. And Jim said, "Well, AJ, you've got great questions, you've got great knowledge, you've got great talents, you have a job. Now first, go finish 6th grade, and come back, finish high school, college, and the job will be here." AJ was about 10 years old at the time, 10 or 11. And he had the moxie, the courage, to talk to Jim Clifton, who is the CEO, Chief Executive Officer of Gallup, about a job. Now, before meeting Jim, AJ was going to be a professional basketball player. Or, if that happened to not work out, he was going to be an announcer of professional basketball. Those were his two career paths. And that's all he was ever exposed to. He knew that's how people did well in life. So what Jim did is he introduced AJ to other options. So he actually got the paperwork done to make AJ a paid intern, even at that young age. And AJ would work on projects with me and other people. But more importantly, he would just sit around with us and talk about life. And he'd talk about how we made decisions and how we went from school to college to career. And through that process, AJ is learning life design. He's figuring out how other people like him and unlike him are making good decisions about their lives. So to bring us back, I want to talk about how we're strangers to our future selves. I want to talk about how we are certainly constructing this future over time, but I want to center that talk on hope. And hope, what I've learned, if you bear with me here, investing in the future pays off today. So for years, I was on dissertation committees with Professor Snyder, and another student would come in, whether in clinical or counseling psychology or education, and say, I found significant results. Hope predicts well-being. Hope predicts job outcomes. Hope predicts, and the list goes on. And it was to the point that our colleagues would just roll their eyes. Oh, another hope study. Another bit of research that says hope is wonderful. And it was true. It got kind of tedious, kind of monotonous. It was like the same finding over and over again. And we had clever studies, like we did pain tolerance tests where we had people put their hands in a bucket of ice water, and the hopeful people are able to tolerate pain twice as long as the less hopeful people. But you can only subject so many people to pain. So we had to move on to other studies. And one thing I tried to figure out is, why is hope always beneficial in these studies? Now, it's not always beneficial in life, but there are rare instances when hope is not beneficial. And it took a long time for me to discover that hope is a psychological investment in the future. It's a psychological investment in the future. And with that psychological investment, we get immediate payoff. So unlike self-regulation and delayed gratification and these other things whereby we forego immediate payoff for a payoff in the future, hope, thinking and feeling about the future in a complex way, gives us some immediate payoff now. So one example of that comes from a study that was done at the University of Michigan. And they went into a Detroit middle school, and they randomly assigned classes of students to two different conditions. Both conditions received a recruitment speech from a researcher who was actually acting like an orientation assistant from the University of Michigan. So, two different conditions, condition one, condition two. Condition one, rah, rah, University of Michigan, come to the University of Michigan, learn what you can learn, you'll have a great life. And if you do, the more higher education you receive, the more money you will make over time. And they showed a beautiful graph of education by money. And this group, condition two, rah, rah, University of Michigan, come to the University of Michigan. Some of you won't go to college, but that's okay. You might become a basketball player, Oprah, an entertainer of some sort, and you'll make millions of dollars. Everybody with me? So condition one, it links education to career, condition and to earnings. Condition two, it decouples education from career and future earnings. The dependent variable was very simple. How many students turned in tomorrow's homework? How many students turned in tomorrow's homework? So you had a brief intervention, you had the same dependent variable, you were 8 times more likely to turn in tomorrow's homework than you are. 8 times. So again, psychologically investing in the future pays off today. Pays off today. We get the behavior of a good student today. Now, what are the futures that our students are psychologically investing in? What are the futures that we're investing in? So through Gallup, we do something called the Gallup World Poll. We ask the same set of questions every year to a representative sample of people in 162 countries. The Gallup World Poll, every year. So I have a lot of data. I am data rich and analysis poor. But what we found out is across these countries, two goals rise to the top when we ask the following questions. Following question: What are your hopes and dreams for the future? What are your hopes and dreams for the future? And those two goals are this. People want a good job and they want a happy family. A good job and a happy family. Now, this is almost in every country where we've analyzed the results. It's an open-ended question, so it takes a long time to analyze the results. We have a group of coders, and this is all they do is analyze the open-ended questions. And we've also asked this question of a representative sample of American students, grades 5 through 12. Same response. Good job, happy family. People are aiming their lives at having something they love to do and people they love to do it with. This is what they're aiming their lives at. They're not aiming their lives at doing well on high-stakes tests. No student in America, for example, ever woke up and said, I'm going to improve the reading level at my school. They don't care about the goals that adults have often. They care about, well, the goals that adults assign to students. They care about these bigger goals of having one day a meaningful way to spend your time and a group of people to spend that time with. They don't invest in trivial goals. They are really looking to us to help them figure out how to get a good job and a happy family. Now also, if we look around the world, people are struggling with the balance of these two. So at times when I was a professor at the University of Kansas in the School of Education, I had a great job and my family wasn't so happy. At times when I moved to Gallup, I had a happy family, but I didn't know what the hell my job was. Now I finally constructed it in such a way that I have both a good job and a happy family. And I'm learning that those two play off each other in a beautiful way. That work and love can play off each other in just this magical way. And that's what I wish for the children in my life and for the people in my life, that they can find a place where they don't necessarily achieve balance, but they achieve this synergy where things are really benefiting one another, work and love, and good job and happy family. Now, we just published a meta-analysis to get back specifically to hope. When we think about what people hope for, they're thinking about a good job and a happy family, and they're behaving differently today. How does that translate to results at work? So we published a meta-analysis that looked at workers around the world. And what we found, and these are workers, these are factory workers in China, these are mechanics in Switzerland, these are American investment bankers. We studied 50 different groups of people around the world, 50 different studies, over 10,000 people, did a meta-analysis of those studies, and we found that hope accounts for 14% of the variance in workplace outcomes, 14% of the variance in productivity, however you measure that. Now, when we peeled that back and tried to figure out how is it that hope helps people achieve at work, we found that 5 things really make a difference. The first one is that hopeful workers show up for work. Hopeful workers show up for work. The parallel is that hopeful students show up for school. So in different countries around the world, we have attendance issues with students not showing up for school. In some urban centers in America, on a given Thursday or Friday, half the high schoolers don't show up for class. Half. So this issue is important both in the school and in the workplace. Hopeful people go to work. They're investing in the future in a way that pays off today, so they couldn't imagine not going to work if they're able. The next point is that hopeful workers are more engaged. At Gallup, we've studied the engagement of over, I think, 17 million people as of today, worldwide. Engagement is the involvement in and enthusiasm for work. What we find is about 30% of the world's workforce is actually engaged at work. About 40% of folks are not engaged. They're just there, just kind of milling about. And about 30% of workers worldwide are actively disengaged. They're undermining the work of others, and they're undermining the performance of the organization. Hopeful workers are almost always engaged. Hope and engagement go together very well. They complement each other. It's hard to find a hopeful worker who's not engaged, an engaged worker who's not hopeful about the future. Next slide. Hopeful workers are more creative. There's some wonderful work being done in Arizona by Suzanne Peterson, who's looking at the work of hopeful people as it relates to creative problem solving. Creative problem solving judged by your boss, creative problem solving judged by others outside of the company, creative problem solving judged by your peers. And what happens is that hopeful people come up with more pathways. We've heard that word from Dr. Savickas and other folks, Dr. Molinese, and hopeful people come up with more pathways. So they're able to see that there are more than one solution to any problem, and they come up with so many solutions just in case one might not work, or two might not work, or three might not work. And overall, they're judged to be more creative than the solutions of less hopeful individuals. Hopeful workers are better during times of adversity and change. So we've been talking about uncertainty. There is a great deal of uncertainty and fear in the workplace. There's a great deal of uncertainty and fear in our lives. And hopeful people do better during those times than less hopeful people. That makes sense. But also, there's a second meaning to this statement. Hopeful people kind of thrive on adversity, change, and uncertainty. It kind of gives them some excitement, some charge to be dealing with complicated, uncertain situations. So the hard part of this is that only half the people in the world are hopeful, based on our estimates. When we look at our Gallup World Poll data, about 90%, about 89% of people in the world are optimistic, which is half of hope, but only half, 50% of people in the world are hopeful. So most people, surprisingly, believe the future will be better than the present, but only half the people believe that they have the power to make it so. So only half are hopeful. So 1 out of every 2 people, maybe even in this room, no, 2 out of 2 are all 100% are hopeful in this room. But in a job situation, in a workplace, 1 out of 2 people are ready for the uncertainty that comes with everyday work and everyday life. And the next slide relates to well-being. Hopeful workers are happy. Now you can do this quick thought experiment. Have you ever woken up happy and hopeless? Oh, I'm sure I'm happy, but I'm certainly full of despair. No, we've done study after study using Gallup data, using data from the universities, using data from community samples, and what we've found is that hope is necessary but not sufficient for well-being. Hope is necessary but not sufficient for well-being. So it's a step towards happiness and well-being, not necessarily, it doesn't account for all of well-being, obviously, but it's necessary for well-being. Now I want to turn to a study that I did just a few months ago, and it was written up in a piece I did for the New York Times, and that's about people who love their jobs. On the next slide. Oh, one more, sorry. So what does it mean to love your job? Well, remember, we measure engagement. We do that very well. So we've measured engagement in people around the world, and we have a good sense of who's engaged at work. So you remember that 30% of people around the world are engaged at work. Well, we also measure something called career well-being. Career well-being. And it's the extent to which you like what you do each day and you get some emotional payoff from what you do each day. So if you just put both of those on a 1 through 5, and 5 being the highest, so I identified all the people who were a 5 in engagement and all of the people who were a 5 on career well-being. Does that make sense? 5, 5, highest of the high. So out of 8,471 people, how many people do you think were a 5 on both engagement and well-being, career well-being? What percent? Raise your hands if you think it's 20%. 50%. 10%. 5%. 1%. You're right, 1%. 106 people out of 8,471 people, a representative sample of Americans, 106 people love their jobs based on those criteria, that you're highly engaged and have a high level of career well-being. So I studied those people. That's the beauty of polling people every night. We poll thousands of people every night around the world. We find something we're interested in. We have their phone number. We call them back up, and we ask them more questions. Okay? So I wanted to know, how are these folks different from people who really liked their job? You remember maybe when you were in college and you had a girlfriend or a boyfriend that you really liked, but you saw no future with them? Okay, that's those people. They really like their job, but they know they're not going to stick with it forever. These people who loved their job, they really loved their job, they really imagine that they might be there a very long time, and they will be getting something from this job over time. There are 4 key differences between people who loved their jobs and people who just liked their jobs. So I'm not counting the people who really don't like their work. Just 1% who love, 20% who like. The first key difference is that people who love their jobs use their strengths every day. They do what they do best every day. As we talk about building a life and constructing a life that we can live well, doing what you do best gives you great joy. Doing what you do best gives you great flow. Doing what you do best gives you engagement. And that's what these folks shared with me, is that they had constructed a job in which they could do what they did best every day. Number 2, they felt like they were an important part of that organization's uncertain future. So certainly the organization, there was one woman who worked at a petrol station, filling station. There was a gentleman who was a priest. There was a teacher. There was a banker. If you think about those different businesses and organizations, they're very different. There was a teacher, and teachers are struggling around the world with support and gratitude. All of them felt as though they were an important part of that organization's future. Now, over the conference, folks might argue that most people don't have access to organizations in which they can feel like they're an important part. But the people who love their jobs feel as though they're an important part of that organization's future. Next, they're surrounded by colleagues who care. They're surrounded by people who care about them. They're not fighting all the time. So, just a quick aside about Danny Kahneman, this Nobel Prize winner. He's an economist at Princeton University. And there are 2 groups of economists at Princeton University. Those who, well, 3. Those who have won Nobel Prizes, those who will win Nobel Prizes, and those who hate these other guys. And the ones who believe that they already should have won their Nobel Prize are pretty ticked off at these guys too, for getting it before them. So that amazing workplace where every economist in the world would like to land is a snake pit. It's a horrible work environment. No one there loves their jobs because no one there feels as though they're surrounded by people who care. So some of those places that look like wonderful places to work from the outside are not necessarily wonderful places to work on the inside. So what happens is they all work from home around their families who care about them, and no one's ever in the department. Next, people who love their jobs are excited about the future because of a leader's enthusiasm and vision. I believe this century will be the century where we truly build bosses who care about us. Not just the bottom line, because that's the only way we can keep people in organizations. It's the only way we can reach productivity goals. It's the only way we can create lives is if we have people around us who care about us and leaders with a vision about the future who get us excited about the future. Now, in interviewing some of these people, I tried to figure out how is it that you got from being maybe someone who liked your job to someone who loved their jobs. And those go along with these findings, and that's on the next slide. Maybe not. What I found from all that study of the 106 people is that love-worthy jobs are made, not found. So if a student says to you, I want a job I can love, you can say, I don't know where those are. If they say, where on the internet can I find a job I love? It's not on there. Because these folks, person after person, said, this was not a job I thought I would love at the beginning. It was a job. But it became a job I would love because of different things that I did as a worker. And those things are listed next. They told me, if you want young people to one day love their work, you have to encourage them to use their strengths every day. Do what they do best every day. Now, I'm biased here, of course, because I work for the Clifton Strengths Institute. With the Clifton Strengths Finder, we've administered the strengths assessment to 8.2 million people since 1999. And what we found is that people who do what they do best really reap the benefits in the workplace and in the school place. So it was affirming to see this, but of course you might want to take this finding with a grain of salt because we think strengths are wonderful. Surround yourself with people who care. So when we ask folks, how do you go about doing that? They said sometimes you switch teams, sometimes you switch shifts, sometimes you shift locations. You might actually go to a different part of a university. You might switch departments, but you need to find people who care about you. My friend at Gallup says, why don't we teach young people to interview the job instead of for the job? Meaning, when you go in and you're looking for a job, why don't we tell young people to really figure out if the people around them will care about them over time? Next, they said they basically crafted the job they had into one they wanted. Job crafting. This is the work of Amy Wisniewski. And Amy is at the, right now she's at Yale. She was at New York University, originally I believe at Michigan. She's now at Yale, and her work on job crafting is excellent. Essentially, it's a step-by-step process that Google is using now to take people from onboarding, from orientation, into the world of work at Google so that they can find jobs that they like and then turn them in to jobs they love. So it's changing tasks, it's changing people, it's changing times, it's changing demands, and the individual worker is given some permission to do all of that. So the organization has to be comfortable with this job crafting approach, but then they allow the individual worker to create new jobs within the organization, jobs that fit them best. And finally, most of the people said they went boss shopping. Boss shopping. So in other words, they changed within the company. They changed from one group to another group. They changed from one shift to another shift. They outlasted a certain boss and had a role in hiring the new boss. So boss shopping is kind of the black belt skill. It's kind of the critical skill of people who love their jobs because it really is a testament to their sense of agency that they would put their jobs in risk in some situations to demand a transfer or demand a different boss. Now, going to the next slide, I want to go back to this issue of followers needing hope. People ask me all the time, what are the key ways to build hope in your life? Well, I'll take a step back. What we wanted to know from followers is, what do you need from leaders? So at Gallup, we polled 10,000 people, and we actually did 2 studies of 5,000 people. So I'll tell you about the botched study, the bad study, and then the good study. In the first study, we asked people to identify the follower that was most influential to them, and then tell us how they were influential to them. So identify the person that's most influential to you as a leader, and now tell me how they meet your needs and what needs they meet. And in that study, we had some interesting findings, but we realized after we reviewed the data that people were listing Muhammad, Jesus Christ, God as influential leaders. Now, as much as chief executives might think they're related to God, we didn't feel comfortable going back to boardrooms and saying, here's what your followers need. based on this polling. So we did the poll again, and we asked people to identify someone who's in your everyday life, who is an influential leader, and someone you actually have contact with in your everyday life. And then we asked the same basic question. Interestingly, we got the same results across the two studies. Here are the 4 followers' needs: stability, trust, compassion, and hope. Stability, trust, compassion, and hope. That's what we want from our leaders. That's what we want from our bosses. That's what people want from their managers. Many of the people identified as influential leaders were preachers and teachers, but many were managers, people at work who led me through the 8-hour day, the 10-hour day at work. So followers need hope, and that hope can come from the enthusiastic leaders that we surround ourselves with. What we found in this study is that folks who said they had an enthusiastic leader, 69% of them were engaged at work. Folks who said, people who said they did not have an enthusiastic leader, 1% were engaged at work. 69% of the people who said they had an enthusiastic leader at work were engaged. The people who weren't engaged at work did not have a hopeful leader. So this role of hopeful leadership is key. And then looking at the next slide, there are other ways to boost hope. And some are traditional counseling methods. In fact, at Santa Clara University, David Feldman just validated a 90-minute hope protocol for college students. In 90 minutes, he can teach hope to your students. 90 minutes. So that's one way. Other ways are a little lighter and don't require so much time. And then other ways require hours and hours and hours. So I'll touch on a few of these different ways to teach hope. And using the next slide, they all boil down to these 3 things. That first, we get people future casting. So thinking about the future, creating those memories of the future that hasn't even happened, pre-living these experiences. And then we get people for planning for the ifs of life. Again, pathways. If we are really good at contingency thinking, we can plan for some of the ifs in life. When we polled over 1 million students using the Gallup student poll, we find that they have tremendous will, but very few ways. Tremendous agency, but very few pathways. So this is the gap, I believe, in young people today, is that they don't understand that there are multiple ways to get from point A to point B. If you tell them to go to point B, they'll start running, but they won't know what direction to take. And then finally, we have to put hope on autopilot in some situations. So I'll address those here in a bit. Taking the future for a test drive. Well, I have to go back. In my abstract, I mentioned, and I don't know how this translates, have you ever washed a rental car? Raise your hand if you've ever washed a rented car. Why don't you wash a rental car? You don't own it. So many of the goals that we ask young people to pursue today are not goals that they really find salient. They're not goals that they find most meaningful. The goals of having a good job and a happy family are those which they find most meaningful. How can we get them connected more to this world of work? Well, really, it's about getting them to take the future for a test drive. So having AJ work with me during the summer, he's able to see how adults do work. He's able to live and breathe work for 8 hours a day over a summer internship. AJ was the young person who did a lit review for me for job crafting. I said, AJ, there's this term, job crafting. It was coined by these folks. I want you to go find everything you can about job crafting and come back to me in a few weeks. And AJ did a wonderful job. At 11 years old, he did better than some graduate students, no offense. He did a fabulous job of reviewing all the literature on job crafting. Now, you can also experiment with becoming less of a stranger to your future self via time travel. So on futureme.org, futureme.org, you can write a letter to your future self. You can write an email to your future self. And for young people and old people, older people alike, this is an intriguing way to get people to think about the future so that they can be reminded of those future thoughts at a later date. So if you have certain things you've committed to doing by the end of summer, then you may want to write a letter to your future self and have it delivered to you in the middle of summer, and then you'd be nudged and encouraged to press on and commit to yourself, commit to your goal. Next, enter the aging booth. Now, all of you, I believe, will end up doing this, but none of you will admit to it. Because what you do is you use an app on your phone or on your computer to age yourself 30 years. Let that sink in. Aging yourself 30 years. So this work came from an NYU marketing professor. What he found out is that when he had college students walk into a room and take a photo of themselves and then just resize it, nothing affected them psychologically. There were no effects psychologically. They would come out of the room and he'd say, if I gave you $1,000 to save, $1,000 today, how much would you save toward retirement? Very little, very little. With the second group, he had them take a picture of themselves, resize it, and then he used age progression software to make them 50 years old. And then you come out of the room and I say, how much money of this 1,000 would you save for retirement? A lot. When you meet your future self, you behave in that person's best interest today. When you meet your future self, you start behaving in that person's best interest today. And that's what I mean by spending time with the older you. Michael and I have a friend, Neil Salkind. He wrote many books on statistics. People who think they hate statistics, that's his book. Neil is the future me. He is my future self. He's 30 years older than I am. He has a wonderful marriage, a happy family. He's retired. He's got tons of well-being. So when I try to figure out how to be like him, I hang out with him. And I try to figure out how can I guide my life and construct my life in a way that I can end up somewhere near what he has today. And I think this is how we can be less of strangers to our future selves. And then one last slide. Oh, that was a good one. Let me wrap up on this note. There are long ways to build hope. We've created programs that are 5-hour programs. We break them up into 1-hour lessons for students of all ages. There are these short ways that might involve age progression and sending notes to the future me. There are different strategies for doing so, but it all involves pre-living the future and taking the future for a test drive. And the more we can teach young people and one another to think about the future in a complex way and a more hopeful way, the more we behave in our best interests today. Thank you.